If your boss is checking in on you more than your parents did when you were in college, or maybe your boss or your manager is constantly reminding you to take PTO, but gives you the side eye every time you do, or continues to nudge you for certain days are better than others, or asking you questions about why you are spending so much time doing one thing or the other, right? This is actually not leadership. This is many would call this micromanagement. I call this corporate parenting. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means today. So, welcome to the Generational Edge with Kristina Green podcast. I am Kristina Green, your generational translator, aka your referee on the generations in the professional work setting and in the wild. Today, we're naming a pattern that most workplaces are stuck in, this idea around corporate parenting, where this is actually quietly killing the trust and accountability in your teams, especially for you as a leader. This is not a conversation about bad bosses, although they absolutely exist. This is about well intentioned leaders who simply do not have the awareness or the tools to be successful in their leadership of people simply because they're doing something that we've always been taught. They're following a playbook that no longer applies, that we've evolved past, but for some reason, the resistance is still there to make progress in the workplace. This is the conversation about being taught how to parent rather than how to lead our teams. So let's get into it. Corporate parenting did not come from anywhere. This is a playbook that has been handed down from generation to generation, right? Both personally as well as in the workplace, because our workplace mirrors how it is that we show up personally, how the structure of our families, the structures of our communities essentially are just are exasperated. They are continued in the workplace and how it is that we continue to work with one another. Now let's talk about what that looks like. Corporate parenting is a concept of over monitoring where you're checking in every single step of the initiative, the progress that's being made, right? Are we another step closer, another inch closer to the work that's being requested, to the execution, to the end result? Are we over explaining how it is that we are to do something? Remember, as leaders, we are to manage the what, right? We are to manage the strategy, understanding the big vision, right? The ultimate goal is to achieve X, not the how. The how is should be what we empower our teams to do. But oftentimes, this is where this sense of control, corporate parenting is, where we have to try to control not only the outcome, not only the result, but how we get there, right? If I tell you to just go take a plane to Disneyland, or I tell you that the objective is to spend a day at Disneyland, how you go about doing that is should not matter to me. If the only result is the outcome that I am expecting is that you would spend a day at Disneyland, then why do I care how you get there? Why do I care what day you choose to spend at Disneyland, right? It's not I'm not over explaining on how to execute. I'm providing you with the result that's necessary in order to achieve the outcome that I'm expecting, right? So it's also to this understanding of corporate parenting is also over correcting where something is not necessarily made to your liking, to your preference. So, for example, have you ever redlined um, a, a document, an executive summary, something that's come back to you where you took it another step further, right? Where this is not just about changing the context of how it is going to be perceived, but this is doing all of the grammatical errors, the redlining that is unnecessary, that in fact actually should be the responsibility of the person who's giving it to you. But instead, you're choosing to take on the redlining yourself, right? Instead of providing overall feedback of here's how we could continue to make this better. This is one thing that I think we need to continue to enhance further. Instead of providing that level of detail, you literally dive in and just start revising the heck out of the thing. That is one example of overcorrection. There's also this understanding of under trust, of not believing that the team that you have, the team that you've put in place to execute on the things that need to get done, on the operations, not trusting them to see it through. When we lean in that way and show up and do any of these other things, over explaining, over correcting, we are or over monitoring, we are essentially leaning in saying that I don't trust you. I don't trust that you can manage or handle this level of responsibility. So I lean in these ways so to make sure that we get where we're supposed to go. Now, this is very different than when you have someone who's not performing or you have a team that's not performing. And if you have an entire team that's not performing, this actually comes down to doing some self-reflection as a leader. Where are your gaps in that you're not providing direction or guidance to your team so that way you can make them successful? Because as leaders, we cannot do the jobs of the people who are on our team. We have to fulfill a role, which is to lead and support our teams, not do the work that we've in fact hired them to do. Where we also see corporate parenting in the workplace is in this idea around attendance policing, right? So, and I'm not talking about those who are abusing the system, misusing the system, right? This is where you're checking exactly what time they come in. Now, this is different. And when you're in an hourly situation and you have employees who need to clock in and clock out due to different labor laws, you need to make sure that you monitor those things. There's a difference between monitoring and when you are maybe over policing them, right? Around exactly what time they clocked in, exactly what time they clocked out. So if we're considering just the salary side, right? So there are guidelines around set times for arrival, departure, things that people work out for accommodations. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm talking about constantly checking when someone is coming in or how many days that they are taking for a vacation, right? Or how frequently, or just the fact that they are actively using their PTO. That's a challenge. Or I once had someone who was tracking my bathroom, goodness, who was tracking how many times a day I was going to the restroom, when I left and when I came back. Now, mind you, at the time I was pregnant. So I think there's a little leniency that should be have allowed it and been allowed in that space. But even if that's not the case, policing someone of when they are coming to and from the restroom is kind of crazy. Also, to this concept of professionalism. Professionalism can be taken in many different ways, but in fact, it's determined based on the person who holds the prejudice around around what professionalism means. Is it how the style of your hair, the way you dress, the makeup you wear or don't wear? Is it the way that you present yourself in a meeting, right? All of these things kind of become this microaggression, if you will, as to how people are showing up and whether or not they earn or deserve any type of placement or promotion in the organization. There's also too the just checking in emails, right? That micromanagement of managing the how every single step of the way. There's this unspoken token, right, that are given to those who are enduring the most. Those people who are, in fact, always reliable, always there. Now, that just leads to burnout. So, setting a high expectation that someone would sacrifice themselves in order to meet your expectations is where we need to start drawing the line, right? That's in the concept or the in the era of burnout right now, where we have this language and we are considering what the impact is, not only on ourselves, but also to on the people around us. This is where we have to lean in from a through a corporate parenting lens. Where are we controlling too much? Where are we trying to over communicate, over correct, over control the people around us? Now, what this can look like between the different generations. So, once again, a disclaimer: we do not use this understanding around generations to as a whipping stick, if you will, in the workplace. This is a way to raise awareness around here are some values that might be typical for these generations. And it's to an understanding as to how it is that you might approach a conversation, approach a scenario with people in your workplace who are of different generations. This is not a hard fast rule to say that every person in this generation is this way, because remember, the cross sectionality across all of the generations is going to be personality, is going to be cultural, is going to be regional. All of these things you have to account for when you're considering the conversation. So, generation is just one element, one identity that we can use to try to understand how to find a common foundation so you can move forward. So, for example, the baby boomer generation, right? They were taught to value hierarchy and obedience. There was not a room for whether or not you can have a say or a voice into how something was done. They inherited the rules and essentially continued to build upon that. And there's nothing wrong with that, because they also too have been at the forefront of building some of the largest, most successful Fortune 500 companies, certainly here in the US, as well as globally. They believe in a chain of command, right? That's how you demonstrate your loyalty. This concept of serving your time is how you get ahead, because this is not about you come in the mailroom today and now can be CEO, tomorrow or the day after. This is about recognizing that there is a process, there is a journey that is to be had in order to achieve some of your career goals. There's nothing wrong with that. It's also too part of how we're evolving in today's workplace. Now, also to a Gen X, as one thing that we understand about Gen X is that they tend to be very resilient, because there's a hallmark around the Gen X generation to we say that they raise themselves. They're highly resilient. So in the workplace, it makes sense that they would also too be more self-managing, that they don't require, if you will, a lot of hands-on. In fact, they start to feel a lot of that overcorrection, right? The micromanagement that from others that is just not necessary, especially where they are in their careers. They are anywhere between 45 to 60 years old, currently in the workplace, and so they either are in the prime of their career, and or they might be all on a glide path to retirement. Either way, the contribution is still important in the workplace along with the boomers. So but they also too may approach work. They may lean into the self-sacrificing, right, for the purpose of getting the job done, right? So they'll work maybe longer hours, and so they'll value putting in that time and demonstrating that. They'll also too value overextending themselves, maybe taking on more than they should, simply because that is the playbook that they've inherited. That's how they've started to run the plays, if you will, in the workplace. Now let's move over to millennials. Millennials, one thing to note, is the highest academically achieving generation in the US of any generation. So, and with that also too comes a high burden of still student loans, educational expenses. And so they have found themselves in the position of wanting to achieve, right? Of looking for career advancement and promotion in a way that can be understood, that is structured. That's why they started to achieve a high, such as high education, advancement in the educational field. They tend to be the children of baby boomers, right? So they also too were instilled many of those values that if you work hard, that's how you get ahead. And so they were raised on receiving that feedback, right? Understanding the measurable outcomes, right? Being given the rubric and understand how to then apply that to life. So kind of transactional in nature, if you will. If I get this degree, if I get this master's degree, that should the pathway to leadership should be much easier, right, and understood. There's also too no gray area. They understand that everything has an answer, which right now is kind of fluid, right? Because while that might have been the case, the millennials are, as I like to say, the last generation to be bamboozled by this outdated playbook. Because as they are advancing in their career, the plays are changing. The game is changing 100%. We went from a career ladder to a career lattice, where it is it is horizontal, it is vertical, it is angular, right? Is constantly moving throughout their careers. And then go over to Gen Z. Gen Z was primarily the children of Gen X. And so everyone has a challenge, if you will, or an opinion about how Gen Z is showing up in the workplace today. But let's remember, they were raised by the most resilient, arguably the most resilient generation that is currently walking the planet. So they also too were raised by an understanding that they have a voice, that their voice should be heard, and that this is not a shut up and go to the kids table, right? This is a no, if you disagree with something, then say it, then speak it out, speak it out loud. Mm. They also too are very hyper aware when it comes to the emotional dynamics. So they are reading different scenarios. They're reading how it is that their colleagues as well as their leaders are either answering questions or dodging questions or open to ideas. So they are showing up in this way simply because they've been empowered to do so. And there's nothing wrong with that because that's part of the evolution that's necessary in the workplace. If we want to have a conversation around burnout, we have to consider how we've gotten there. And that is primarily based on the plays that we've been running, this outdated playbook that we've inherited from generation to generation about how work is done, about how work is executed, how, when, and where, right? That's what's being challenged, and that's what's causing an awful lot of friction that many leaders are just ignoring today. We taught leaders how to manage people, much like schools teach children. And we wonder why this hierarchy essentially is failing us today, because we're treating adults like they are still children, like they are still in the learning phase of their lives, right? This idea around do as I say, don't ask questions, earn your right to speak and to promote and to advance. Now, if you don't believe me, Gallup actually has some stats around this. So engagement fell to 20% in the US in 2025. That means that that's costing the US market, the US employers over $10 trillion in lost productivity every single year. Now, and at the stronghold of that, what the variable that is impacting the team engagement the most is Gallup found that 70% of the variance in team engagement was due to their managers, right? So how their managers were interacting with the employees, that is what is impacting that figure, the level of engagement for their teams. And then also too, Gallup found that 21% of US employees trust their leadership. Now that's only 21% of US employees trust their leadership. Now, if that doesn't answer the question around people, why people are shifting not only between industries, between jobs, between companies, and let's take all of the layoffs that are happening right now, which I call just bad behavior by employers, which will be rectified at some point. Humans are what make your business relevant and profitable. And so when we rely too heavily on technology, that's when that pendulum is going to swing back because we're we're misplacing the trust onto the tech and failing to recognize that the tech is only successful if you can also to balance that with the humans that need to be part of your operations. So, okay, that is I think soapbox number 1 for today, and we'll keep going. So, it's important to say that this is not a feelings issue. This is a leadership system issue. So when we have a breakdown in engagement, when we have a high turnover, when we have a distrust or a mistrust that is within an organization, that is because the leadership system that we have in place is failing us. It's not supporting the evolution that is constantly in motion, even regardless of how you feel about it, it is changing. The workplace is changing. How, when, and where work is done, and what people require in order to execute, that is what's evolving. So, this corporate parent energy versus a leader energy, right? So, let's talk a little bit about that. So, corporate parenting energy is more so control, right? That is what creates the safety in our environment. The leadership energy is more so around clarity. When you provide that clarity, people then feel safe. That then leads to trust, right? So rather than compliance, meaning to success, when people feel accountable, when they feel responsible of being able to execute on a particular task on their role as a whole, that is when people start to lean into trust because they feel the trust from their leadership. So more so, this corporate parenting energy is around this proximity, means productivity. So, meaning if I see you working, that means you're working. If I don't see you working, then you must not be working. You must be goofing off, right? Or there's a doubt on whether or not you are actually being effective and productive. Well, the leadership energy leans more so into, remember, it's about the outcome, the result. It's not about how you get it. It's about what you do, what it actually what actually comes out. It's the outcome, it's the result. It is not the road or the journey that you take to get there. Now, you can measure how it is that those that your teams are engaged along that process, right? You certainly don't want them going completely out of the way. This is why we help to provide some guidance, but we do not guide each and every step. If they get off track, we help to get them back on track, right? So, corporate parenting can feel supportive to some extent, and in fact, has been for many decades until people start to realize that it's resembling the lack of trust from their leadership. That is when things start to feel more so like a sense of control and less like a sense of support. So, what this is actually costing you is these parenting systems essentially are allowing people, I mean, what we call today is quiet quitting, but essentially it's just people leaning back in and just doing what their job description says. It's no longer going above and beyond. It's this concept of the threat of work ethic, right? That we instead of people going the extra mile. No, they're just doing what they're being told, right? They're learning how to be helpless, how to instead of leaning in and trying to problem solve by critically thinking through an issue, they're looking for answers to every single question, every single barrier, every conflict that arises. They're looking for guidance from their leader in that way. Now, no one has time for that, but when you foster that relationship or that environment, your team becomes dependent where they're where they shouldn't be. They start to feel helpless, and this is a learned helplessness. They also become passive in their resistance, so they could care one way or the other. It doesn't matter, right? Just tell me how to do it. Just tell me what you want. It has that energy instead of leaning in and trying to problem solve collaboratively or on their own. They just are looking for the direction and the guidance instead of trying to problem solve on their own. And ultimately, this causes our leaders to lean in too much. It requires them to spend too much time managing as opposed to providing, being strategic, being visionary, providing problems to solutions to larger problems. It's about, and it leads to burnout, right? Because no leader can do the job of their entire team because that's not their job. You cannot build ownership in an environment that is designed for obedience, right? So where we cannot appreciate, where we cannot allow voices who even may not disagree or may disagree with an approach. When we do not foster that psychological safety in the workplace, you get silence, you get obedience, you do not get collaboration. Performance issues are actually just trust issues. And those trust issues are bred because we have a gap in our leadership system, in the structure that we are allowing people to develop and grow in into becoming natural leaders in the workplace. Okay, now it's time for my favorite part in the podcast where we talk about the decoding of the generations. And today we're going to be talking about this concept, the word support. So, what does this look like when we start to cross section this with the different generations? So, let's look at this from a generational angle, right? What does support look like for each of the generations? Once again, this is just an awareness on how it is that you might be able to find a common ground across those you're working with, even personally. So, what does support look like for from through the lens of a baby boomer, right? Where they value direction and structure. And so that's how they'll show up with their teams, as well as also to the courtesy that they will request from others. They understand and believe that common sense should prevail, right? That not everything has to be explained, and to some extent, they're absolutely right. So they take a hands-off approach, if you will, to managing their teams, because they will also too have this presumption of accountability, that you understand that this is the task that needs to happen, or this is the task that needs to be executed. And they will be hands off on that. They will not micromanage you. They will just expect you to get it done. Now, that can be reasonable and unreasonable in in some scenarios, but that's their approach. They believe in providing you the information that they believe you need in order to execute. And if you have questions, then you'll come back to them. But they're not going to lean in and ensure that you have clarity. Now, once again, this is not all baby boomers. This is just can also to be personality driven. Well, I didn't need that level of hand holding, so I'm not going to give it. So this is where we advocate for ourselves if there's a gap. Okay. Now, next, let's get into Gen X. Gen X might view support as getting out of the way, right? Not being a barrier for you to execute. So that can lead to, to maybe gray areas, to things that are unclear, expectations that are unknown because they were not stated. They believe in providing that what and letting you figure out the how. Now, if you need guidance on the how, they will support you. But they believe that support is giving you or empowering you to take the ball and run it up the field, right? Now, millennials might approach this a little differently, that they're looking for that feedback and that collaboration, right? They may lean into the group think model for execution, and even through, the iterative process. They might be seeking feedback on a more regular basis to make sure that they're being guided down the right path, because they don't want to get to the finish line and essentially you tell them that what they've just spent all of their effort on essentially is lost, right? Now, Gen Z, support, it can look like the psychological safety in the workplace and clarity. Now, I'm going to say this again. This is not about feelings. It's not necessarily about you leaning into their feelings about how they feel about doing their job. This is more so about having the fostering an environment that allows the conversation to be heard when it comes to them voicing an authentic view that they have for themselves. That's important. Now, this is not about, well, my feeling about how you feel about me having a headache 3 days a week that then causes me to do XYZ. That's not what we're talking about. I'm talking about the psychological safety to know that they can have a voice in the space, to know that they can control or have the autonomy to be able to execute. Remember the how, not necessarily the what. They will take your what, but they want the autonomy over the how it is that they execute. And in order to do that, they need the clarity. They need to understand what success looks like, right? What is the expectation and how they can meet it. So when we have support without trust, it just feels like micromanagement. It just feels like supervision. It doesn't feel like the leadership qualities that any of us are trying to foster. So next time, before you start to move into providing more support, I want you to ask yourself and ask your team, what kind of support actually helps them to do their work best? Right. Now, wrapping all of this up, understanding corporate parenting is understanding that this is common. This is not something that it's probably a concept you've never heard of before, but corporate parenting exists in every environment because it's how we show up with a sense of control for how work is being managed, how work is being executed. While it is common, it's not inevitable that we can evolve past it, right? It's where we are today, but it does not have to be where we are tomorrow. And it's not something that's going to change overnight, but it does require an awareness to how it is that we're showing up and leading our teams today, or even showing up as an individual contributor on our teams. Are we leaning into micromanaging our colleagues and how it is that they are going to deliver work to us? Now, unless it's part of your requirements, it's unnecessary, right? So when we lean into making sure that we can understand the intentions for how it is that we are completing the work that we're doing, how it is that we are showing up to be supportive of one another within the space of the work that we are responsible for, right? And not trying to control everything else around it, because that control is what gets us in trouble. It's what leans us into the energy of control, of corporate parenting more. And that is the resistance that most people are having in the workplace today, right? Around the evolution of how it is that we're trying to break out of this mentality of managing or controlling everything around us, instead of allowing it to evolve in a way that is meaningful and supportive of all of us in the work that we're trying to do every single day. And corporate parenting is the norm, but it's also the system that needs to be renovated, right? It's the playbook that we need to revise and or perhaps maybe even toss out. Because the future of work does not need better parents or parents per se. It needs better leaders who understand how to lead today's professionals. And that is not through the lens of a teacher or a parent. It is through the lens of a coach, right? There's someone who's trying to help evolve and to improve the next generation moving through the workplace. Otherwise, we won't have a workforce. That is all the time that we have for today. I thank you so much for joining me on this conversation. And I want to know, what questions do you have? What's still lingering? Because this is just the beginning of this conversation around corporate parenting. If you've been hanging around me for a while, you know that I bring this terminology into the work that we do because it needs to be said. We are showing up as parents at work, whether we are leaders, managers, supervisors, or individual contributors. This is how it's how we're showing up today, but it needs to evolve in the workplace tomorrow. So, if you want to be part of that journey, then let's keep having this conversation here. If you've got questions, I want you to put it in the comments. Send me a message. You know how to reach me. All my information is in the show notes. But also, too, if this felt familiar to you and you want to have a better workplace, you want to understand how we can continue to evolve to the place where we all deserve in the workplace, how it is that we're showing up for one another, then I want you to like, share, and or subscribe to this podcast because we are going to be breaking open some of the norms, challenging some of the traditions that exist within corporate environment for the purpose of evolving the workplace for tomorrow. So thank you so much for joining me today. This has been the Generational Edge with Kristina Green podcast. I am Kristina Green, your host. And until next time, take care and I'll see you soon.